The internet told me that BS Fire Emblem sucks. Is this true? Yeah, I can't really do deep voices, dang. Well, anyway, let me get to that. If there's one thing you can definitely take from the announcement of this new Fire Emblem game, it's that, well, the fanbase is kind of fragmented. For a lot of Westerners, including myself, the Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem games were their introduction to the franchise, and still sit there as being among their favorite game entries. As such, we tend to compare every other Fire Emblem to the Game Boy Advance ones to judge which ones we like and dislike accordingly. Before that time, though, there was the Japanese import and ROM scene, and that scene generated a lot of fans of Fire Emblem Seisen no Keifu for the Super Famicom. When you get right down to it, Seisen is basically completely different from the typical Fire Emblem game. So, yeah, that fragmenting goes pretty far back. If you would like to hear more specific details about how these games play and how they're different, you can probably go find some other review for them, because I want to keep this short. But anyway, I personally am one who thinks Seisen used to be the most overrated game in the franchise before a certain other one came along. Yeah, I went there. Anyway, in comparison to the Western audience, most Japanese gamers grew up on the Famicom and Super Famicom Fire Emblem entries, and as such the Akanea saga is still among their favorites. Now here's where even more fragmenting takes place, because many Westerners hate these games. And to be fair, as someone who grew up playing the Game Boy Advance Fire Emblems, when I go back to these, it's a bit difficult for me too. I mean, I plowed through and I beat Mancho no Nazo with this fan translation quite a while back. But that class system, the map design, meaning Starlight, the beat math, I did not like any of that. Still, I put it in perspective. And with all that said, let's finally get to BS Fire Emblem. Now, I had just shown some Mancho footage a bit back, and as you can tell, BS Fire Emblem looks pretty similar. That's because it is similar. It's based on Mancho. So immediately you can tell why many of the other Fire Emblem fans would be put off by the mere idea of playing this. Which is basically why I'm making this video. Now, before I begin, I would just like to remind everyone that the maps in Shin Mancho no Nazo, even though they are superficially the same, play completely differently, so don't use this review as any sort of basis for judging them. So back to what I said earlier, yes, Fire Emblem is similar gameplay-wise to Mancho no Nazo, but its structure is completely different. Every chapter is standalone. That means you can kind of approach it more like Advance Wars, which is interesting to think about. In each chapter, you got predefined units, and you gotta make do with them dealing with whatever the objective is, which is usually more or less survive until the story plays out. Oh, speaking of that story, it's kinda soundlink only, so if you're kinda playing it on an emulator, you wouldn't get any of it. Which might explain something else about why Seisen fans may not like this. I bet many of them don't even realize it had a story, complete with this spiffy CG art that was only on the Soundlink broadcast. I even went as far as redumping the ROM, and I couldn't find these in there. Oh, and speaking of things that would be specific to the Satellaview, there's a certain gameplay mechanic that is typical in Satellaview games that most Fire Emblem fans don't even realize is in this. Alright, BS Zelda footage. You know where this is going. Timer events. That game clock on the bottom left corner of the screen in BS Fire Emblem, it's one of the most important things in the game. You kinda need to pay attention to it a lot, because things happen tied to the game clock. Enemy reinforcements? That's a timer event. Getting more criticals than usual? That's a timer event. You want to pay attention to this because you want to know when you need to plug that reinforcement spot or when the best time to go after the boss is. If you aren't paying attention to this stuff, then the maps, which are already a bit harder than typical Mancho maps as it is, will seem even harder than they actually are. By the way, most emulators will start the game at 0 minutes in. That's not even the correct time the game starts. Please check that, guys playing emulators. I mean, otherwise you'll be waiting like a whole 20 minutes more for Frost to join your party in the middle of episode 2. And you need all the bishops you can get. Similarly, if you played the games accurate to broadcast time, Dice and Malice would join you a lot quicker than if you play them based on the default emulator setting. Now, with all those fine notes out of the way, I can get to some pros and cons. Personally, I like aspects of BS Fire Emblem's plot, or what you can get of it from the transcripts and the Nico Nico Doga broadcasts, as well as the map design. The new characters were interesting and subverted Fire Emblem norms, and I was glad to see them return in Shin Mancho no Nazo. I also liked the idea of taking the minor characters from Mancho and giving their own unique standalone adventures to embellish their personalities a bit. As for the cons, well, this game pretty much convinced me that Nina is a bitch. But obviously, the most serious problem is that you only have 4 chapters at an hour each. BS Fire Emblem could have used the Satellaview treatment of having a whole bunch of episodes, but I guess if that happened, none of them would have gotten ROM-dumped. Ha ha ha! And of course, since this is based off Mancho no Nazo, there's no weapon triangle, no rescue. It's basically just Mancho, minus some of the more Mancho-specific bullcrap, such as Math and Starlight and whatnot. Oh, and not needing the lore to visit villages, yeah. So that all said, who would I recommend to play BS Fire Emblem, besides myself? Well, if you put up with the Famicom Fire Emblems or Mancho no Nazo, you'll be able to deal with this just fine as well. You might also like these if you wanted to have a Fire Emblem game that you approach a bit more like an Advance Wars game. And if you're building yourself up to take on Thracia 776, this is probably the second hardest of the Super Famicom line. Of course, it's also good for stress testing your Satellaview emulation. Haha! As for who should rather avoid the game, well, to start, I believe most of the people who trash-talked BS Fire Emblem back in the day were probably introduced to Fire Emblem through Seisen. So, if you are more of a Seisen fan, then I don't think your opinion is going to change much after my review. That's because the most dialed-down aspect in BS Fire Emblem compared to other games in the Fire Emblem franchise are the RPG elements such as stat building and social interactions. Also, don't go complaining to me if you can't get the ROM to run in ZSNES correctly. And with that, I think I'm kinda more or less out of time for this review, so let me just flap this random numerical score and call it a day. Oh, and by the way, if you're holding out for a fan translation, there is one that's going on that's a work in progress. You can download a bit of it at the Serene's Forest forums. Although, do be wary that last I checked, the game clock on it is still kinda broken. When's that update coming? Apologies that this one came in a bit slow. It doesn't seem like I'm able to produce these videos at the pace I want. Still, I'll keep working on them. Maybe someone can suggest to me some filler I can put up while I work on them.